All right, we will now get started. My name is Bianca Flockstra, and I am Ideal's Strategic Learning and Capacity Development Advisor. But before we dive into the content of today's session, I wanted to give you a quick background. In April, as the COVID-19 pandemic became serious, Ideal launched a COVID-19 learning series to provide a space for food security and nutrition practitioners to discuss the challenges they were facing and learn from each other's adaptations, as well as identify gaps in terms of both knowledge and tools or resources to address the challenges. Based on stakeholder input, we created 5 learning streams, each exploring one topical area, and you can learn more about these learning streams on the FSN Network website. One of these learning streams is focused on strategic management of food security activities during COVID-19, and that brings us to today's session. The pandemic has really put a spotlight on the importance of our activities being adaptive and agile in order to keep improving food security, nutrition, and resilience among the most vulnerable. Even as our context drastically changes, scenario planning or contingency planning can be an effective tool for programs to do just that. In today's session, we will start with an introduction to scenario planning and explore some of the related concepts and terminology. We'll do a short Q&A session, question and answer. And then lastly, we want to hear from each of you about your own experiences of scenario planning and any questions you have around it in a breakout room session. I do want to acknowledge the USAID BHA staff that we have with us today. We've been working very closely with BHA in the designing of this event for several months now, and we're happy to have them join us today. So it is now my pleasure to hand it over to Piers Bocock, who will kick us off. Piers is a recognized international development leader and innovator with a focus on developing and implementing effective adaptive management, organizational learning, organizational development, and engagement approaches to deliver results and impact. He is a principal and international development practice lead at Acute Insight and previously served as chief of party for the USAID Knowledge Management and Learning Contract, LEARN, which worked with USAID to develop its collaborating, learning, and adapting framework. We are thrilled that he's serving as a senior adaptive management advisor for us on the IDEAL activity. Over to you, Piers.
Thank you, Bianca. It's great to be here and see so many people interested in scenario planning and adaptive management. I see we've already got 53 people online, which is fantastic. I hope that we can deliver some helpful content today and facilitate some interesting discussions. But before I start my session, I'd like to start by taking a quick look at the poll you all just filled out. Maya, could you pop those results on the screen? All right. So far, we have already a majority of people logging in from the United States, but we've got representatives from all regions so far, except for North Africa and the Middle East. And we do expect other people to be joining as we move along, and we'll be recording this session and saving it and sharing it with people after the fact. So the second question is, what is your understanding of the term scenario planning? As I'll be talking about, scenario planning is a set of practices that often goes by different names. So we have a nice sort of range here, but it seems like the majority of people are here to learn more about it. We've got 35% of folks saying they have a sense of what it is, and 32% of folks are saying they've got a bit of an understanding, but maybe perhaps could use some guidance in how to incorporate it into their work. So that's perfect. And then the third question, what is the primary reason you are attending today's session? And the largest number of people are saying that they want to better understand what scenario planning is and what it involves. And then another significant size group wanting to know how people talk about and do scenario planning. And then also a fair amount of people who'd like to learn about resources and capacity strengthening opportunities. So that's fantastic, and that is what we are here to talk about today. So that helps get just a little bit of a sense of who's in our community today and where they're coming from, both physically and technically. But before we get into what I've been asked to talk about today, I want to cover a couple of brief housekeeping points for anybody who has joined since Bianca was making her announcements. So for anyone who joined a little bit late, I want to reiterate that we have interpretation services available in French and in Spanish. And our request is that if you go to the small globe at the bottom of your Zoom window that says interpretation, then please select a language that you would like to hear today's webinar in, English or French or Spanish. Please do select English, even if you want to hear my voice. It will allow the interpreters, if they need to break in, to be heard. Also, later on in this session, we'll be doing breakout rooms, and we'll be offering those same options for Spanish and French. And if you prefer a Spanish or a French breakout room, please identify yourself in the chat box now, so that we can be sure to put you in the right room when the time comes. Second, I want to encourage you to add questions that you have as I'm talking into that chat box in the Zoom window at any point during the presentation. We'll have a little bit of time after my comments to address some of them, but then we are also committed to reviewing them all and trying to answer them following the webinar, and to get answers back to all attendees. Okay, I think that's the admin stuff out of the way. Let's get this show on the road. So, my role today is to help frame and demystify what we mean by scenario planning. I want to provide a high-level overview of what people mean by the term scenario planning, including some definitions about what it is, share some reasons for why we do it, and then provide a high-level framework for how to do it. Now, this is an introduction, a sort of getting on the same page session. It's not, so it's going to provide those sort of topics at a high level. And then after that, we'll get into breakout discussions and talk in more detail about your experiences and your questions and your needs. But before I do that, I have a few important framing points to make. First, this session is not a training session. Its purpose is to help bring us to a shared understanding about what we mean by scenario planning, as well as how and why people use the process. But if there's enough demand for capacity development and support for this discipline among today's participants, then we will make sure that scenario planning is a prioritized topic for the adaptive management curriculum we plan to start rolling out later this program year. So it's great to see that there are people here who want to know more about tools and resources in capacity development. Second, just because the term scenario planning may seem unfamiliar to some people, doesn't mean you're not already doing it. This is one of the fundamental principles of adaptive management and collaborating, learning, and adapting. We're all doing it. We just may not have put it into that category in our brains. The process we'll be talking about today can go by any number of names, including, as Bianca said, contingency planning or futures analysis. Some people put it just within strategic planning, and there are many others. Third and most important, scenario planning at all levels follows a fairly similar systematic set of steps, though the purposes and the degree of detail can vary widely. But I submit to you that whether the process is being done at a global level by organizations like USAID or a small organization striving to be prepared for any eventuality in a discrete region of a country, the methodology is similar, and I'll show you that today. Fourth, scenario planning should be considered an important but only partial component of a comprehensive strategy development, project implementation, and adaptive management approach. Okay, so with those announcements out of the way, we'll get into talking about the topic of the day. So when I talk to people about scenario planning, whether it's implementers in country or students at universities or with development partners here in the States, I find it helps to start with a range of definitions that together can help paint a picture. So this may feel very rudimentary, but let's just start with a definition of scenario. So a scenario is a situation that could possibly happen. That's from the Macmillan Dictionary. In other words, it has not yet happened, but could. Now, planning. The process of deciding how you will do something before you do it. That's also from Macmillan. So it's a process, it's planning. Therefore, a pretty straightforward definition for scenario planning could just be the process by which you make decisions and plans now about how you would respond to a possible future situation. Make sense? Let's look at a few more definitions. So as I read through these definitions, please just listen for similar themes. Okay, here's the first one. A technique of strategic planning that relies on tools and technologies for managing the uncertainties of the future. That's from Kotler, one of the preeminent business school content producers working today. Here's another. A strategic planning method that some organizations use to make flexible long-term plans. Nice, simple, that's Wikipedia. Here's another. Making assumptions on what the future is going to be and how your business environment will change over time in light of that future. That's from a small strategic consulting firm, which I think describes it nicely. And then finally, I love this one, a process to explore and prepare for alternative futures. Very short and sweet. That's from ODI. So hopefully you're starting to hear some common themes, but I would be remiss if I didn't share a little bit about how USAID talks about scenario planning. So to USAID, scenario planning is a fundamental component of its adaptive management approach. In USAID's discussion note on adaptive management, and I've included a link here, the guidance note says that systematically examining a range of possibilities in a given country or region enables the agency to address the range of contextual changes that may occur in the course of strategy implementation. And the principles that we're hearing here are really important. It is a recognition that it is very hard to plan now for 6 months, 1 year, or 5 years down the road, and the agency recognizing that things will change. How do we plan for that? And while USAID and BHA have been encouraging scenario planning as part of activity management for some time, as part of a larger systematic adaptive management approach, it is particularly relevant right now. For anyone who's seen the most recent BHA guidance to food security partners operating in COVID-affected areas, it includes a directive to engage in regular scenario planning, to keep pace with and adapt activities, interventions, and operations in line with rapidly changing context on the ground, including anticipating and preparing for possible worst case scenarios. And then, of course, for those of you who are familiar with or have even just heard about USAID's Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting framework, scenario planning is an important component therein, and it's nestled within the learning component. Okay, so that's a little bit about the what, the definitions, and I hope you're starting to see some common themes. Let's briefly talk about why scenario planning is important. So why do we value it? Well, hopefully the definitions that we just went through have helped make the case that it can help support overall effectiveness by being better prepared for changes that may be beyond our control. Second, and more timely, it's to be better prepared to adapt for when the current COVID-19 conditions change. Even if none of us were adequately prepared for the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, we now recognize that scenario planning can help us better be prepared for when the nature of this global pandemic changes again. After all, we won't be in lockdown forever. The question is, how will we know when to adapt? And how might we adapt depending on how conditions change? And then third, a very obvious reason is that our funders strongly encourage us to do that. So for organizations outside of the USAID realm, often taking the time to do scenario planning can feel like a luxury. Here, we have our funders supporting the idea and telling us it is important to take that time. So let's make sure that we do. And if those aren't enough reasons, here are just a few more. I mean, the future is uncertain. We all know that. We like to think that we can plan for it and be prepared, but our work often depends on conditions well beyond our control. And while we cannot control changes in external conditions, effective organizations are prepared to adapt to such changes. Intentional scenario planning allows us to create monitoring systems to identify early warning signals that conditions may be changing. And one of the driving forces behind the work that I do is that an organizational culture that embraces scenario planning is better prepared to be adaptive in planning and implementation, and therefore more likely to have the potential for long-term sustainability. Okay, now that you've heard some of the definitions about what scenario planning is, and you've heard some reasons behind why organizations do scenario planning, let's talk a little bit about how it's done. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through 6 basic steps that are remarkably consistent across all of the guidance around how to do scenario planning, no matter what size the organization is or what kind of strategic challenges you're trying to address. Please note that these are general principles that align with the process, and that when and if we do more in-depth training, we'll provide you with practical tools that you can use for the process. I think there's somebody who may be unmuted. So here are the 6 steps at a high level, and I'm going to walk you through each of them at a general level, and then we'll apply them to a simple example just to try to make it more practical and help you see that we actually do this all the time. So we call the first step define boundaries. This is where we look at our current goals and assumptions, the scope of the planning exercise, and the time horizon for the scenarios. What are we looking at? How far out are we looking about the conditions that could change? Next, we identify the main drivers that could impact the possible future that we need to consider, including indicators to track those changes. Then, once we're clear about the main drivers of possible change affecting our goal and our time frame, we make sure to gather as much data, information, and input as possible. This includes information we may already have, as well as external data available to us. And it's also really important to consult and discuss with key stakeholders. And then we should take some time at that point also to assess the likelihood or impact of these context changes. Then, with all of that, what we do is, and I'll show you how a simple framework for this, we develop at least 4 discrete scenarios using a simple process, which involves mapping 2 of the most influential external drivers on a 2x2 grid. And I'll show you how this allows us to look at 4 possible scenarios, which we can then flesh out in more detail. Then we apply these potential scenarios to our goal and time frame by asking what if questions to understand how each of these possible scenarios would impact our work, our strategy, and our future. And then finally, with a clear understanding of what these possible futures look like, we develop plans for how we would adapt should any of them come to pass. So now let's take a look at a simple example of how this might be applied. So let us say that, this is a very simplistic case, but it might be real for some of you. I know it's real for some friends of mine. Let's say that our goal is to plan a wedding 3 months from now. So we're going to do a super fast walkthrough of how we can systematically do scenario planning for this. So in this case, the boundaries, that's that first level, that we are defining is, so the goal is to hold a wedding for 100 people, 100 of our closest friends, 3 months from now. Now, one of the obvious challenges for planning for such an event is the lingering and pervasive uncertainty of the COVID-19 situation. Do people want to come to a wedding? Would they travel? Would they want to be in the same space? So the infection rates of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we are planning our wedding, is obviously an essential driver of the future 3 months from now. That's the time frame we're setting. You know, we want to think about the mobility restrictions that might be in place. We want to think about locations we would need to consider, imagining what the world looks like here 3 months from now. And it will be also important for a couple of reasons to be thinking about what the weather is like. If we can't be indoors for a gathering, we want an outdoor location. But is this wedding going to take place in a location where it's likely to be nice outside? Or is it going to be freezing cold? Are there chances of rain? So the weather is an important factor too. Now I'm oversimplifying it, but it's to try to make a point for how we can set up the creation of scenarios. So let's take a look at what we know now about these drivers. So thinking about infection rates, understanding our audience, the people that we would invite to that wedding, would they be willing to travel? What other factors would impact their decision to attend? So then we revisit our thinking around those key drivers. We pick 2 to play with. And in this case, just to show you how it works, we're going to decide to go with infection rates and weather 3 months from now. So let me show you how we then create our scenarios. So on this slide, you'll see we've taken those 2 context factors, infection rates on the x-axis and weather on the y-axis. At the top of the y-axis, I go back for a sec. Thanks. On the top of the y-axis, we have this perfect weather, and on the bottom of the y-axis, we have awful weather. On the right side, the x-axis, we have minimized infection rates. Let's say rates are going down. Maybe there's even a vaccine. And on the far left, we have uncontrolled infection rates. Let's imagine things are not getting better at all. So that gives us this kind of the 4 boxes then. And now we can go to the next slide, which shows then at a very simple level 4 basic scenarios. Our best case scenario is the one at the top right. Infection rates are going down. Perhaps there's a vaccine out there, and the weather in general is nice. We don't know what it's going to be like on the day, so we have to plan for that. That would be our best case scenario. Obviously, our worst case scenario would be that COVID infection rates are not getting better, and we live in a place that 3 months from now, it's likely that the weather is going to be cold or bad or both. And then the other two scenarios are mixtures of good conditions and bad conditions of those two factors. So essentially, we now have 4 possible futures. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in that example, at that point, we then say, we go to that what if piece. So what if these are the conditions? These are our 4 scenarios. We really try to flesh those out now to understand how those external factors could control our possible future. And then we start putting some detail behind those scenarios. So let's go to the next slide and I'll show you what I mean. So in our best case scenario, let's say the COVID infection rates are dropping, the weather's in general nice, and there's a good chance it's going to be sunny. Well, we can move ahead and start planning for the wedding. And we could have it maybe wherever we want. It could be indoors or outdoors, depending on the weather. But we know that in that scenario, there's a good likelihood that we'll be able to get good in-person participation. If COVID infection rates are still really bad, we're in a place where weather is not going to be our friend, well, then maybe we need to have a virtual only wedding, or maybe we have to cancel it altogether. I should say postpone, not cancel. On the other hand, if we know that we are in a place where weather is generally nice, we could consider, this is the top left, a very small outdoor event, maybe with some virtual participation. On the bottom right side, if we see that the COVID infection rates are going down, maybe there's a vaccine, but we're not sure about the weather, well, then we could plan an indoor wedding. So I hope that sort of shows how these steps then, if we go to the next slide, help to pull together a process for getting to the scenarios and then planning for them. It's sort of a misnomer in a sense that the real scenario planning is actually at the end of the process, but these steps to get there, particularly the data that help make those decisions, are the ones that are important. So if we have those scenarios, then we have to figure out, okay, how are we going to know when one of those scenarios is, say, going to be our future? Well, we would monitor the COVID-19 infection rates. That's our driver. If we have a driver and we can monitor the data, we look at that. We look at the general weather trends for the place, the region, the city where we're having our wedding. But then we also need to have the flexibility for, even if it is often a beautiful day, maybe it's going to rain. So that's going to impact how we choose the locations that we use. So you can see how these are all help figure into that. So then the next slide essentially is a very, very high level but basic view of how the process all comes together and how it helps us prepare for various possible scenarios. Now, I should stop and say, even if we have our goal and we have a number of drivers, we picked 2. We picked infection rates and weather. You can run this same process with any 2 factors. So if it had to do if you didn't want to pick weather and you wanted to pick budget, or if a year from now, infection rates, COVID-19 is under control, maybe it's budget and weather. It's a framework for being able to prepare for possible scenarios and then plan to monitor the situation and then plan for them. So this table is a gross oversimplification, and in no way do I endorse the idea of doing scenario planning in 15 minutes. It is an exercise that I am sure that your stakeholders, our partners from USAID, and others would say it is worth taking the time as a team to think these things through. And it's often at the point of our work planning when we would do this, and then taking a moment to pause and reflect, say each month, just to look at the indicators, and then on a quarterly basis to see, has our scenario, has our operating context changed? So if there is, again, I'm just reiterating what I said earlier, a need and an interest in capacity development around really digging into this process with sort of a facilitated approach, or perhaps a cohort-based approach to doing scenario planning with tools and templates and resources, then we can do all of that. We're already pulling together some worksheets that could be supportive for people doing this process in a real life scenario. So I know I've talked enough, and I'm sure it's much more than perhaps you wanted to do. I think that hopefully the next part of our webinar will be much more interesting when we get to actually talk amongst each other about our questions and our experience. So I do want to leave you with a few final thoughts, though. So first, there are some common principles that underpin this whole process, no matter what you call it. First, there's just this acceptance that our success or failure may be linked to factors beyond our control. We can have the best team, we can have the best plan, we can have the best budget, and we can have the best partners. But something can come along and upend our entire world. And COVID-19 is the most present, practical, and global example that everybody can relate to. Foresight, having the time, making the time, valuing the time to deliberately understand what context factors could impact our intentions and our goals is essential. Third, having the intentionality as part of your implementation to take time to plan for different scenarios. The next one is preparation. To adapt is better than flexibility to react. I'm sure that every single person on this webinar right now has adapted as best they could this past year to the pandemic and to many other situations that are going on in country. I certainly for myself feel like if I had been better prepared for something like this happening, I could have been even more effective in my response. So let's do that moving forward. It's never too late to start scenario planning. And then finally, learning from our experience and from each other's is a critical input to the process of scenario planning about the future. So that's it for me, my friends. I think we have a few minutes set aside for some questions before we move into those breakout groups. And just to reiterate, if you have questions, keep adding them in the chat and we'll compile and synthesize them and respond to them and share them back with all attendees. So Bianca, I think this is where I turn it back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Pierce. Before we move to the breakout room part of our session, let's just pause for maybe one or two very quick questions from you, our participants. I did not see any questions in the chat box while Pierce was presenting. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and simply just raise your hand, or the hand raising feature in your Zoom, or just unmute yourself and ask your question, or you could still put it in the chat box. So I'll pause here if anybody has a question for Piers. Piers, we have one question in the chat box from Patrick. Is scenario planning done primarily during project implementation or also during proposal development?
Great question. And I would say it's the reverse. Scenario planning can be an essential part of proposal development. And then it is revisited, as I was sort of alluding to, on a regular basis, whether it is in your quarterly reports or your annual reports, ideally meeting with your counterparts. The point is, if we step back, and I have purposely not talked a lot about theories of change and elements that not everybody on the call is required to do. But when you are developing a proposal, whether you explicitly include a theory of change or it is implicit in your proposal, you have assumptions. Those assumptions are often driven by the context of the proposal, what you've heard from the funder, what the funders asked you to do. Those assumptions are the basis of our current working situation. But as part of that proposal process, a really rich proposal process identifies those assumptions and what could change, and then what we would do. So I would suggest that it should be part of proposal development, but it should be kept, the actual reviewing of those major indicators, those factors that will change your context, on at least a quarterly basis. And then you can say, if we notice that we've changed, well, we have a plan for that scenario, and that's this. So it is a regular part and an integral part of an adaptive and intentionally adaptive management approach.
Thanks, Piers. And just one more quick question, but I want to remind everybody that we'll gather any other questions that come through, and we'll be answering them and sending them out along with the other resources from this event. So one last quick question before we go to breakout rooms: is scenario planning different? Is scenario planning a different document than a log frame?
Yes, but they are intricately connected, because a log frame, again, has certain assumptions based in that. If they're just at the highest level, the simplest level, the log frame is saying, if we do this and this happens, then we expect Y to be a result, and then we hope to contribute to outcome Z. The if is huge, and those are those assumptions. So the log frame is a very useful tool in scenario planning, but it's not the same, because the log frame is essentially laying out one scenario. And I'm not saying, and I don't want anybody to get worried or feel overwhelmed that I'm saying we have to develop 4 log frames. What I'm saying is that if we understand the if part, those assumptions that we are working on that drive our work plan, then we can say, what are those other factors that could change that, and be on the lookout for them, and be able to have those early warning signals. I see there's another question about that, about early warning. For example, now, 9, 10, 12 months ago, COVID infection rates were not something that impacted the work plans of most of us on this call. Let's be honest. Now, it's probably part of all of our planning, because we recognize that it will impact us. and then that becomes an early warning signal.
All right, well, thank you, Pierce. It's time to move on, but as I said, we will make sure to answer all your questions. You can keep posting your questions in the chat box throughout the remainder of the event, and we will get to them in our post-event materials. So we will now move into breakout rooms for some deeper discussions about scenario planning. And if you didn't identify yourself in the chat at the beginning of the event on your language preference for the breakout rooms, please do so now. Just put your name and what language you prefer between Spanish and French. If you don't put anything, we'll assume you are an English speaker. So each breakout room will have a facilitator, and we'd love to hear about your own experiences of scenario planning, as well as what you're missing in resources, tools, or support that can help you apply and integrate scenario planning in your programs moving forward. So please click on the link that we're putting in the chat box now. You'll also get the link from your facilitators in your breakout rooms, and then just follow the prompts on your screen to join your breakout room. So we will see you back here in approximately 35 to 40 minutes for closing. So we will see you back here soon. Wonderful. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had fruitful and interesting conversations in your breakout rooms. So I'd like to invite Solomon and James. James, you'll be after Solomon, just to quickly share out maybe what was one high level takeaway that came from your discussions in your room.
Ok, je peux aller en français comme vous pouvez traduire, n'est-ce pas?
I am going to speak in French and then you can interpret into English, right? Yes. We had a very small group, but we were very dynamic as regards discussions. The discussion was very rich. We had people in our group who already did scenario planning activities, so it was very interesting, and we were talking about the different factors we talked about today. And we talked about planning in urban context, and we focused on that scenario, also on agriculture and other contexts in which we are working. I mean, the people who were part of the group. It was a very enriching discussion we had. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Solomon, for sharing. And James, I'll have you share as well. I'm sorry I can't get to all the facilitators due to time, but James, just one high-level takeaway.
Yeah, one high-level takeaway from my group is that one of the key ingredients in a scenario planning process is having the right people in the room in the process. My team felt that of all the things that we need to consider, we need to think about the people that will make it happen, and so having the right people as you build the scenario planning process would be one of the key ingredients. Other than that, we've learned that scenario planning has been used by folks, in different contexts, other than just COVID-19. So while COVID-19 presents the most pronounced scenario for deploying scenario planning processes, it's also been used in other contexts like security contexts, or in natural hazards, across the globe. So it's not necessarily like a COVID-19 built up discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, James. So you might have seen another 2-question poll pop up on your screen. So please just take a moment to fill that out. And then also we're sharing the link to our evaluation for this event. It's always invaluable for us to get your feedback so we know how to improve our future events. So please do fill that out. And then as for next steps, we will send out the plenary recording from this call, as well as the PowerPoint presentations, which you might have seen earlier in the chat as well. And we will also do an FAQ document answering any and all questions that we received that we weren't able to get to. We'll also analyze all the input from the breakout sessions, and that will help inform IDEAL on how we can best meet your needs in terms of tools and support around scenario planning in your activities. Please make sure that you're subscribed to the FSN network for future events and activities. And thank you again to everybody. Please don't forget to fill out the evaluation. Thanks for joining, and thanks to our presenters and our facilitators and everybody who is involved today. Before you log off, just turn on your camera so we can wave goodbye to everybody. It was great to see you all here today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.